She was standing at the edge of a Missouri River camp with a baby on her hip and nothing in her eyes that looked like goodbye. Her husband had no weapon worth speaking of, no map of where he was going, and no certainty he would come back. His church had asked him to march 2,000 miles into a desert for a government that had done nothing to help his people. His family would winter on the open plains without him. What do you do when the people you love most need you to stay, and everything you believe tells you to go? Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives. What you are about to hear is one of the most extraordinary and least told stories of the entire American frontier. A march that covered nearly 2,000 miles of desert, mountain, and hostile territory, carried out by a people who had every reason to distrust the nation, asking them to fight for it. If you are new here, subscribe and stay with us. We tell these stories the way they happened. No mythology, no shortcuts, just the documented truth. For those already part of this community, welcome back. We want to know your thoughts in the comments. If your community had been driven from your home at gunpoint, would you have volunteered to fight for the same government that let it happen? Leave your answer below. Now, let us go back to the summer of 1846. To understand what the Mormon Battalion actually was, and why it existed at all, you have to understand what the Latter-day Saints were in the summer of 1846, and what had been done to them in the years leading up to it. Because the story of this march cannot be separated from the story of why 500 men, in the middle of a desperate flight across the American prairie, agreed to turn around and walk in the opposite direction for the country that had abandoned them. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had been founded in upstate New York in 1830 by Joseph Smith, a young farmer who claimed to have received divine revelation through a set of ancient gold plates. The theology Smith taught was, by any measure, radical, a complete restoration of what he described as original Christianity, with new scripture, new organizational structures, and doctrinal claims that set the church apart from every other Christian denomination in America. It attracted converts quickly. It generated hostility with equal speed. By the mid-1830s, the church had already been driven out of Ohio and Missouri. In Missouri, the situation had escalated far beyond religious hostility into organized, documented violence. Governor Lilburn Boggs issued what became known as Extermination Order 44 in October 1838, directing the state militia to treat Latter-day Saints as enemies who must be exterminated or driven from the state. This was not rhetoric. The order was executed. Mobs burned homes, destroyed crops, and murdered members of the community at Haun's Mill, where 17 men and boys were shot in and around a blacksmith shop, while women and children hid in the surrounding timber. The community fled to Illinois, where they built a city called Nauvoo on the banks of the Mississippi River. For a few years, they found something approaching stability. Nauvoo became one of the largest cities in Illinois by 1844, with a population rivaling Chicago. Joseph Smith served as mayor and was overseeing construction of the Nauvoo Temple, the centerpiece of his theological vision for the community. Then Smith was murdered. On June 27, 1844, a mob stormed the jail in Carthage, Illinois, where Smith was being held on charges his enemies had manufactured. He and his brother Hiram were shot and killed. The state militia, which was supposed to protect them, stood aside. The men responsible were never meaningfully prosecuted. The state government expressed regret and did nothing that mattered. The church did not collapse. Brigham Young, a carpenter from Vermont who had converted in 1832 and risen through remarkable force of will and organizational intelligence to the second position in church leadership, took control of the community. He was not a prophet in the charismatic mold of Joseph Smith. He was something arguably more valuable in a crisis. a builder, a planner, a man who could look at a shattered community and calculate what it needed to survive. What it needed to do was leave. The violence in Illinois continued and intensified through 1845. Farms were burned. Members were shot at on public roads. The Nauvoo Temple, completed at enormous community cost, was seized and eventually burned to its foundations. It became clear, in the most literal documented sense, that the Latter-day Saints could not remain in Illinois without being destroyed. Young began planning the Exodus in late 1845. The destination he had chosen was the Great Basin, a vast, arid region beyond the Rocky Mountains that, in 1845, was still technically part of Mexico and entirely beyond the reach of American federal authority. There were no American settlements there. There was no American law. There were no American mobs. There were also, it should be said plainly, no established roads suitable for wagon trains, no reliable water sources for a large emigrant column, and no agricultural infrastructure of any kind. But Young was not looking for comfort. He was looking for a place where his people could exist without being murdered for existing. The exodus from Nauvoo began in February 1846, in the teeth of a Mississippi winter. The river had frozen solid, which proved fortunate. The ice provided a crossing that the community used to move wagons and people to the Iowa side before it thawed. Thousands of men, women, and children crossed the Mississippi River onto the Iowa prairie and kept walking west. By the summer of 1846, the leading edge of the migration had reached the Missouri River at a place called Council Bluffs. Young established a temporary settlement here called Winter Quarters on land that the Omaha Nation permitted the Latter-day Saints to use for one winter. He was trying to organize the largest planned overland migration in American history, and he needed resources he did not have. Into this camp, on June 26, 1846, rode Captain James Allen of the 1st United States Dragoons. Allen carried a message from Colonel Stephen Watts Kearny requesting that the Latter-day Saints provide 500 volunteers for a military expedition to California. The United States was at war with Mexico. Kearny needed men. The request was, by any conventional measure, extraordinary in its audacity. The federal government had watched, with what could charitably be described as indifference, as this community was driven from 2 states, their prophet murdered, and their homes burned. The state of Missouri had never repealed its extermination order. The Illinois government had done nothing meaningful to prosecute Smith's killers. The federal government had received petitions and documented evidence of these crimes and had responded with sympathy letters and no action. And now that government wanted soldiers. Brigham Young spent perhaps 24 hours making his decision. The accounts of his reasoning that survive in his journal, in the records of the Church's Council of 50, and in his public address to the community show a man thinking on multiple levels simultaneously. The money was the most immediate calculation. Allen's offer specified that each volunteer would receive the standard Army pay of $8 a month, plus clothing allowances that could be taken in cash. 500 men for 12 months meant roughly $48,000 flowing into the community's treasury. In 1846, that represented the difference between a migration that might succeed and one that almost certainly would not. Young needed wagons, oxen, food, seed grain, and tools. The Army was offering to fund a significant portion of that, but Young's reasoning extended beyond the immediate financial arithmetic. He was thinking about the long-term political position of his community. If the Latter-day Saints were perceived as disloyal, as enemies of the American project, they would never be left in peace wherever they settled. If they could demonstrate, in the most public and documented, Way possible that they were willing to serve under the American flag, even after everything that flag had failed to protect. They would have an argument against future persecution that was much harder to dismiss. He called a meeting and asked for volunteers. The response was not enthusiastic, it was honest. Most of the men in winter quarters had not joined this community to march into a desert under an American flag. They had joined for religious reasons, and their recent experience with American government was not a record that inspired trust. Many had wives and children who depended entirely on them. Many had already lost everything once in Missouri and Illinois. The debates that took place in the weeks before the battalion mustered are documented in multiple journals and letters. Families argued. Men who wanted to go were sometimes persuaded to stay because their wives were pregnant or their children were ill. Men who had no particular desire to go were sometimes persuaded by the community's financial desperation. Some men volunteered because they genuinely believed it was the righteous course. Some volunteered because the social pressure in a tight-knit religious community is a powerful force. What is documented is the outcome. On July 16, 1846, 543 men were mustered into service as the Mormon Battalion, organized into 5 companies lettered A through E in standard military fashion. Each company had a captain, a first lieutenant, a second lieutenant, an orderly sergeant, and 4 duty sergeants. The battalion had a surgeon, a chaplain, in the person of Elder Jesse D. Hunter, and, in an arrangement that Army regulations permitted in theory but rarely saw executed so deliberately, a number of women who had been designated as laundresses and refused to be left behind. These women require more than passing mention. Melissa Burton Correa was 20 years old and had been married to William Correa for less than a year when the battalion mustered. She was not going to send her new husband into a desert alone if there was any way to prevent it. She applied for laundress status and was accepted. Lydia Kennison Hunter, wife of the battalion chaplain, had crossed the Mississippi with the community in February and spent months on the Iowa prairie, developing a clear sense of what she could endure. Phoebe Brown Rawlins and Susan Davis also joined the column. The total number of women who traveled any significant distance with the Mormon Battalion is documented at approximately 20. All of them knew when they joined the column that they were walking into terrain that had ended expeditions before. They went anyway. The march south from Council Bluffs to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, covered roughly 250 miles and took approximately 3 weeks. The route passed through Missouri, the same state whose governor had issued an extermination order against these very men 8 years before. The soldiers marched through towns that had cheered their persecution. They passed farms that might have been built on ground where Latter-day Saint homes had stood. No incidents were recorded. At Fort Leavenworth, the battalion received its official equipment: muskets, cartridge boxes, haversacks, canteens, and uniform components. The clothing allowance, $42 per man, was immediately contested in the most practical way possible. Army regulations allowed soldiers to receive the allowance in cash rather than issued clothing, and most of the battalion members exercised that option at once, sending the money back to their families rather than accepting Army-issue uniforms. This meant that a significant number of soldiers who would march through the Sonoran Desert would do so in civilian clothes rather than Army issue. Captain Allen was already ill when the column arrived at Fort Leavenworth. His illness, described in contemporary accounts as inflammatory fever, almost certainly typhoid, progressed rapidly. He was placed in the post hospital and died on August 23, 1846. His loss was felt genuinely. Allen had been a fair and reasonably sympathetic officer. His replacement was Lieutenant Andrew Jackson Smith. Smith was a career Army officer, West Point educated with years of frontier service, and a manner that contemporaries uniformly described as abrasive. He had no familiarity with Latter-day Saint culture, no sympathy for the community's history, and conventional military expectations about discipline and the relationship between officers and their men. The battalion members had different expectations. They had volunteered under specific terms. They observed the Sabbath as a day of rest. They did not use alcohol or tobacco under the word of wisdom that governed their health practices. Elder Hunter occupied a position of moral authority that the men regarded as legitimate, alongside and sometimes above the military chain of command. Smith regarded these expectations with undisguised impatience. The conflict came to a head over the question of the women. On August 27, 1846, while the column was still crossing Kansas, Smith issued an order that the women and all physically unfit soldiers be detached from the main column and sent to Pueblo, Colorado, a small settlement on the Arkansas River, to winter over. His reasoning was straightforward military logic. Women and invalids slowed the column, consumed supplies that combat-capable soldiers needed, and created complications a desert march could not afford. The battalion's response was anguish measured in journal entries. Men who had already left their families once were being told to separate from their wives again in the middle of a march through unknown desert, to be sent to a settlement none of them had seen. Melissa Correa wrote in her later account that she wept and initially refused to comply. William Hyde's journal records a sustained, quiet fury expressed in religious language that reads, "Across 175 years, as entirely understandable human anger." Elder Hunter argued with Smith directly. The argument was witnessed and documented. It resolved in the direction that arguments between chaplains and commanding officers generally resolve. Most of the women were sent to Pueblo. Approximately 80 men whose health made the desert crossing inadvisable were sent with them. A small number of women, Melissa Correa, Lydia Hunter, Susan Davis, and perhaps 2 others, were permitted to continue, listed officially as laundresses. The remaining column turned south and west toward Santa Fe. The Santa Fe Trail in 1846 was a well-traveled commercial highway, worn deep into the prairie soil by 25 years of merchant traffic. The battalion followed the mountain route, which tracked the Arkansas River west to Bent's Fort before turning south, a longer path than the Cimarron Cutoff, but one that offered water and avoided the worst of the dry stretches. They made reasonable time across Kansas and into what is now southern Colorado. Bent's Fort on the Arkansas River was the last established supply point before Santa Fe and one of the best-informed locations in the Southwest. William Bent had spent 2 decades cultivating relationships with the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other Plains nations, and had accumulated knowledge of the country west and south that no government map could represent. What he told the column's officers about conditions west of the Rio Grande was not encouraging. The route through the Sonoran Desert was long, dry, and largely unknown to wheeled vehicles. The desert crossing of southern Arizona was, in Bent's informed judgment, the most dangerous section of the entire route. By the time the battalion reached Bent's Fort, Philip St. George Cook had taken command. Cook was 41 years old, a career Army officer who had served on the frontier for 2 decades and had strong opinions about nearly everything. His first assessment of the Mormon Battalion was dismissive. He described the men, in surviving correspondence, as worn down, poorly equipped, and insufficiently disciplined. He noted the unusual command structure with Hunter in what he considered an inappropriate position. He noted the men's insistence on Sabbath observance and refusal of alcohol. He also noted, in passing, that the men were all sober. he would come to understand precisely what that observation was worth. The column entered Santa Fe on October 9th, 1846. General Kearny had taken the city 7 weeks earlier, moving with extraordinary speed from Fort Leavenworth. The Mexican defenders had offered no serious resistance. When the Mormon Battalion marched through the plaza, they found American flags flying over adobe buildings and a U.S. military government barely 2 months old. Kearny himself was already gone, pushed west toward California with his regular Army dragoons. He left Cook with orders to follow with the battalion and establish a wagon road to the Pacific. The challenge those orders represented was, in practical terms, enormous. Between Santa Fe and San Diego lay more than 1,000 miles of terrain that no wheeled vehicle had ever traversed on a mapped route. The country south and west of the Rio Grande was a landscape of desert basins, isolated mountain ranges, and river courses that could be dry for months and dangerous with floodwater after a single heavy rain. The water sources were widely spaced and unreliable. The forage for draft animals was sparse. There were no roads, only the trails that Spanish missionaries and Mexican traders had worn into the desert floor over the previous century, designed for mule trains and pedestrians, not for wheeled wagons pulling supply loads. Cook's orders were not simply to march his men to California. They were to cut a wagon road, to pioneer a route that supply wagons could follow. Every canyon, every mountain pass, every river crossing had to be evaluated, not just for whether men and mules could cross it, but whether wagons could cross it. This added immeasurably to the difficulty of the march and immeasurably to its historical significance. The route Cook chose went south from Santa Fe along the Rio Grande, following the river's valley before turning west into the desert. The Rio Grande Valley in late October was neither comfortable nor immediately dangerous. There was water. The column made reasonable time through a landscape of small Mexican farms and ranches whose residents watched the American soldiers with wary eyes. The documented interactions with civilian populations along the Rio Grande section are consistent and, given the context, remarkable. The column paid for what it took. It did not steal livestock. It did not intimidate or assault the people it passed. In a period when American military forces in Mexico frequently did all of these things, the Mormon Battalion's behavior stood out. Cook noted it in his official correspondence, not in terms of praise, but in the absence of complaints, which was itself a form of documentation. West of the Rio Grande, the desert opened. The Chihuahuan Desert in November 1846 was cold at night and hot during the day, with a temperature range that the men's inadequate clothing made acutely uncomfortable. Many of them were still in the civilian clothes they had substituted for Army issue when they sent their clothing allowances home. The road surface changed from the hard-packed soil of the river valley to sandy desert floor, and the wagons began to feel the difference. Draft animals that had managed the river valley in reasonable condition started to labor on the sandy slopes. Water became the central preoccupation of the march. Cook pushed the column hard, driven by the knowledge that the water sources along the route were widely spaced and not always reliable. When scouts reported a waterhole dry, the column had to push on to the next known source, sometimes marching through the night rather than camping without water. The men learned quickly to fill every canteen at every opportunity, to be conservative with water consumption, and to recognize the signs of dehydration before it became dangerous. Henry Standage, a 22-year-old English convert from Oxfordshire who had emigrated to Nauvoo in 1845 and joined the battalion at Council Bluffs, kept a journal throughout the march that is one of the most detailed first-hand accounts that survives. His entries during the desert crossing are models of controlled understatement. Marched 22 miles, he wrote on November 18, 1846. Very dry. Found water near sunset. Or on November 20th, no water today. Many men struggling. Continued after dark. What Standige's terse entries do not fully convey are the fuller details recorded elsewhere. Men scraping water from muddy puddles in dry creek beds, mules dying of thirst and having to be cut from their harnesses, soldiers discarding equipment to reduce the weight they carried through killing heat. But the emotional register of the journal, the steady, forward-moving quality of the entries, the refusal to dwell on suffering, the careful noting of small mercies and brief reliefs, captures something essential about the battalion's collective psychology during those weeks. The campfire songs deserve particular mention here. Multiple journal accounts record that the Mormon Battalion sang regularly throughout the march. Hymns in the evenings, folk songs during rest breaks, occasional choral performances at Sunday services that Cook eventually permitted because he was practical enough to understand that prohibiting them would cost him more in morale than it gained in discipline. The songs are documented in several journals by title. They create an unusual counterpoint to the otherwise bleak descriptions of desert conditions. Men who had marched 20 miles through waterless country, who were 1,000 miles from their families, who had no certainty about what lay ahead. These men gathered around fires in the desert and sang hymns. It is one of the most human details in the entire record of this march, and it is fully documented. The San Pedro River Valley, reached in mid-December 1846, was a genuine relief. Water, shade, forage for the animals, and a chance to rest and repair equipment after weeks of hard desert marching. The San Pedro ran north from Mexico through what is now southeastern Arizona, fed by mountain springs and supporting a ribbon of cottonwood and willow that made it one of the more ecologically productive areas in the desert southwest. It was also home to a large population of feral cattle. The Cimarrones, cattle descended from Spanish mission herds that had gone wild after the missions were secularized and their operations collapsed, ranged through the San Pedro Valley in substantial numbers. They were not the gentle domestic cattle the battalion members had known on Illinois and Missouri farms. They were big, rangy, long-horned animals that had survived in the desert for generations by being aggressive, suspicious, and fast. They did not regard the column of American soldiers moving through their valley as a welcome presence. On December 11th, 1846, a herd of these animals intersected the line of march. What happened in the next several minutes is documented in at least 6 separate journal accounts that agree in their essential details even as they vary in emphasis. The cattle charged the mules. This requires explanation that the journals sometimes skip over. The mules were the critical non-human resource the battalion possessed. Without mules, the wagons stopped. Without wagons, the supplies that kept the men alive were reduced to what they could carry on their backs, which was not enough. The mules were irreplaceable, and they were terrified of the charging cattle. The panic spread through the column in seconds. Mules bolted. Wagon harness snapped. Wagons overturned. Equipment flew in every direction. Private William Corray wrote that the cattle came through the column like a storm, and the mules went mad with fright. It was impossible to describe the confusion. Private Amos Cox was gored in the leg by a charging bull, a serious wound that kept him in a wagon for several days, but did not kill him. Several mules were injured. The column's careful order dissolved into chaos for the 10 or 15 minutes the cattle were running. When the dust settled and the cattle had passed, the men collected their equipment, repaired what could be repaired, and continued. Cook filed an official report noting the incident. In that report, in the formal language of military documentation, he recorded it as the Battle of the Bulls. The name was not ironic. It was the official military designation for the only significant combat action the Mormon Battalion engaged in during its entire 1,400-mile march from Council Bluffs to San Diego. These men fought a herd of feral cattle in a desert river valley. That was their war. The encounter with the Mexican garrison at Tucson was a different kind of test entirely. The Presidio at Tucson was a small, walled town on the Santa Cruz River, approximately 150 miles west of the San Pedro crossing. It was garrisoned by Mexican soldiers under Captain Antonio Comaduran, who had perhaps 100 men available. When Cook's advance scouts reported the garrison's presence, Cook faced a decision about how to proceed. He chose diplomacy. Cook sent a message to Comaduran laying out the situation honestly and practically. The United States and Mexico were at war. Cook's column was an American military force with orders to march to California. He intended to pass through Tucson regardless of what the garrison decided. He had no interest in killing Mexican soldiers over a town that would inevitably fall under American control. He offered fair payment for supplies. He requested that no resistance be offered. Comaduran read the message, counted his soldiers, assessed his options, and made the decision that sensible commanders in hopeless positions have always made. He marched his garrison out of Tucson before the Americans arrived. The Mormon Battalion entered Tucson on December 17, 1846. No shots were fired, no blood was shed. Cook paid fair prices for the flour and dried beef the column needed. The men rested for a day, repaired equipment, and attended to medical needs. The interaction with Tucson's civilian population is documented in several journals and reflects something important about the character of this military force. The residents had every reason to be frightened. They were civilians in an occupied city during an active war, and the army occupying them was foreign. The battalion members understood this, and the journals document a consistent effort to treat the population with courtesy. Standige's entry for December 17th notes, "The people came to watch us with curiosity and some fear. We paid what they asked. Some of the men played with the children. We left no harm behind us." That phrase, "we left no harm behind us," appears in various formulations in multiple accounts of the march. It seems to have been something the men were collectively and consciously tracking. They knew their behavior was an argument they were making on behalf of their community. West of Tucson, the column entered the section of the march that survivors would later describe as the most severe. The Sonoran Desert proper, the low desert of extreme temperatures, minimal water, and sparse forage, lay between the Santa Cruz River and the Gila River, and the column had to cross it with animals that were already in declining condition. The mule losses accelerated. Each dead mule meant the remaining animals had to pull harder to move the same loads, which meant they wore out faster, which meant more dead mules. Cook ordered the wagon's loads reduced. Non-essential equipment was left behind, cached, or abandoned by the roadside. The official supply manifest shows a systematic reduction in carried weight as the desert crossing progressed. Tools were left behind. Excess ammunition was cached. The column stripped itself to the minimum required to survive. Even stripped down, the desert was taking its toll. Men who had been in reasonable health when they left Santa Fe were losing weight and strength. The combination of heat, dehydration, inadequate food, and unceasing physical demand was producing a slow collective deterioration that the journals document with quiet accuracy. Standige, who had been writing careful entries throughout the march, reduced his observations during the hardest stretches to bare necessities. The reduction in his prose was itself a kind of document. What sustained them was not any single dramatic source of strength, but a combination. Religious faith that gave the suffering a framework of meaning, the social bonds of a community that had survived worse together, the forward momentum of a column that had no practical option but to keep walking, and the knowledge, frequently repeated in the journals as a kind of mental anchor, that California existed and was a finite number of miles away. The Pima villages along the Gila River, which the column reached in the first week of January 1847, represented the most significant single turning point in the entire march. The Pima, the Akimel o Autumn, people of the river, had been farming the Gila River Valley for centuries. Their agricultural system was not primitive subsistence farming. It was a sophisticated, engineered operation refined through generations of experimentation and accumulated knowledge. Their irrigation canals, some of them several miles long, drew water from the Gila and distributed it across fields of corn, wheat, cotton, and squash that, in January 1847, were producing surpluses large enough to supply a passing army. When Kearny's column had passed through 6 weeks earlier, the Pima had traded with the Americans at fair prices. When Cook's battalion arrived, the same welcome was extended. The scale of what the Pima provided was not a courtesy gesture. It was, in practical terms, a rescue. The battalion's supply situation, which had been declining since Tucson, was effectively stabilized by the Gila River trade. The men purchased several thousand pounds of flour, dried corn, dried squash, and pinole. They purchased fodder for the mules that was arguably more critical than the food for the men. The animals' condition had deteriorated to the point where another 100 miles without adequate forage might have made completion of the march impossible at any reasonable pace. Standige's journal entry for January 10, 1847, describes the Pima villages with genuine wonder. He described the irrigation canals, the orderly fields, the substantial storehouses, and the well-built houses in language that suggests real surprise. The desert traveler's shock at encountering abundance and organization where he had expected only scarcity. "These people live well," he wrote. "Their fields are larger than many farms in Illinois. They want for nothing that the river can provide." The observation was accurate. The Pima's agricultural mastery was the product of centuries of sophisticated land management in one of the most demanding environments on the continent. American settlers of the era routinely dismissed indigenous agricultural systems as primitive. The Gila River Valley in January 1847 was the opposite of primitive. Cook's official report noted the Pima's cooperation and the quality of the provisions they provided. He was more terse than Standige. He was writing for military superiors. But the substance of his assessment was the same. Without the Pima resupply, completing the march to California would have been significantly more difficult and might not have been possible at the pace required. This is a documented historical fact that deserves more emphasis than it typically receives. The Mormon Battalion's successful completion of its mission depended, in a measurable and critical way, on the agricultural expertise and generous trading of an indigenous community in the Sonoran Desert. The conventional narrative of frontier expansion tends to present indigenous peoples as obstacles or background scenery. The Gila River Valley in January 1847 was neither. Beyond the Pima villages, the route followed the Gila River west toward its confluence with the Colorado. The river's banks in this section were choked with cottonwood and mesquite that slowed the wagons considerably. The current was unpredictable. The column cut brush, corduroyed soft ground with branches, and man-handled wagons through sections that the mules could not pull. The work was exhausting and slow, adding to the accumulated exhaustion of months of desert marching. The Colorado River crossing came in the third week of January 1847. The Colorado in winter was cold, fast, and swollen with runoff, from the mountains to the north. At the point Cook selected for the crossing, the river was roughly 300 yards wide, the current was strong, and the California bank was steep and difficult. The Quechan people, whose territory included the confluence of the Colorado and Gila rivers, observed from the California bank with the watchful neutrality of a community that had dealt with Spanish expeditions and Mexican traders for generations and had developed considerable expertise in evaluating the intentions of strangers. Cook made contact through a small advance party, conducting negotiation through hand signs and basic Spanish. The Quechan provided information about the ford and some assistance with the crossing in exchange for trade goods. The transaction was practical on both sides. The crossing took most of January 21, 1847. Wagons were partially disassembled and floated across on improvised rafts. Mules swam. Men crossed on ropes stretched between the banks, wading in current that sometimes reached their chests. Equipment was soaked. Several animals were lost to the current, but the column crossed. That night they camped on the California side of the Colorado River. They were in American territory, the territory their orders named, the territory they had been marching toward for more than 3 months. They still had more than 100 miles to go. The Colorado Desert, the stretch of sand dunes and dry lake beds between the Colorado River and the mountains east of San Diego, was the final trial. In some respects, it was the worst, not because the conditions were more extreme than what had come before, but because the men knew they were close. The knowledge that California was reachable made the desert's continued resistance feel more personal than it had in the abstract miles of Arizona. The sand was deep in places, soft and yielding, pulling at wagon wheels and mule hooves with every step. The dry lake beds provided firm footing, but no water and no shade. The temperature swings between the burning days and the frigid nights were extreme. The mules, already in poor condition from the weeks of desert crossing, were failing more rapidly. Cook drove the column with the same relentless forward momentum that had characterized the entire march. He had calculated the remaining distance with enough precision to know that the pace had to be maintained regardless of the men's condition. The men maintained it. Warner's Ranch in the mountains east of San Diego was reached on January 29, 1847. Colonel John Warner, a Massachusetts-born immigrant who had become a Mexican citizen and established a ranching operation at one of the natural springs in the mountains, received the column with the guarded hospitality of a man trying to determine what the war meant for his own future. He sold them supplies at market prices. The men of the Mormon Battalion ate real food for the first time in weeks. They drank from a spring that ran clean and cold. They slept on ground that was not in any active sense trying to kill them. The formal entry into San Diego came on January 30th, 1847, 102 days after leaving Santa Fe. Approximately 1,400 miles of desert, mountain, and river crossing since the Rio Grande. The march was over. The immediate military situation in San Diego when the battalion arrived was, in operational terms, anticlimactic. The war in California was essentially won. Kearny had arrived weeks earlier and had fought the Battle of San Pascual against Mexican lancers, a costly engagement that left his force besieged on a hillside for 3 days until a relief column broke through. By the time the Mormon Battalion marched in, the organized Mexican military resistance in California had effectively ended. There were no battles for the battalion to fight. Instead, they were put to work doing what they had, in some essential sense, been doing throughout the march: building things. In the months between their arrival in San Diego and their mustering out in July 1847, the Mormon Battalion constructed barracks, repaired the Presidio fortifications, built the first brick building in California under American authority, dug wells, graded roads, and performed the systematic infrastructure work that the establishment of American governance required. The brick building deserves specific mention. Battalion member Levi Hancock, who had masonry skills acquired before the march, directed the construction of a kiln and the production of fired brick from local clay. The resulting structure was a permanent mark on the landscape, the first of its kind in American California. San Diego, in January 1847, was a small collection of adobe buildings around a central plaza, with a crumbling Spanish mission on a hill to the north and one of the finest natural harbors on the Pacific coast. The American occupation was barely 2 months old. The physical infrastructure of American governance had to be created from nothing. The battalion members created it without drama and without complaint. And the absence of drama and complaint in the historical record of this period should be read as what it is: evidence of character. Philip St. George Cook spent the months in California completing the official documentation of the march. His survey, conducted by topographical officers throughout the route, produced maps that would make the Mormon Battalion's wagon road available to subsequent travelers. Those maps were formal military documents, precise, carefully annotated with information about water sources, forage availability, road conditions, and the locations of settlements and landmarks. They were published and distributed to the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, incorporated into official cartography, and eventually made available to civilian travelers. Every emigrant who took the southern route to California in the 1849 gold rush, every mail rider who carried dispatches along the Butterfield route in the 1850s, every railroad surveyor who evaluated the southern corridor in the 1860s and 1870s drew on knowledge that Cook's survey had produced and the Mormon Battalion's march had generated. Cook issued his farewell address to the battalion on July 16, 1847, exactly 12 months after their enlistment at Council Bluffs. He gathered the men and read it aloud, and what he said is worth reproducing in full because it represents one of the most remarkable documents in the history of the United States Army. History may be searched in vain for an equal march of infantry. Half of it has been through a wilderness where nothing but savages and wild beasts are found, or deserts where, for lack of water, there is no living creature. There, with almost hopeless labor, we have dug deep wells, which the future traveler will enjoy. Without a guide who had traversed them, we have ventured into trackless tablelands where water was not found for several marches. With crowbar and pick and axe in hand, we have worked our way over mountains which seem to bar all passage, he continued. Thus, marching half naked and half fed, and living upon wild animals, we have discovered and made a road of great value to our country. Arrived at the first settlement of California after a march of 1,125 miles, a distance greater than from Boston to St. Louis, we were, by orders from above, quickly restored to our country. Soldiers, I have been received with courtesy and treated with justice by you. I feel that I owe you much. I am proud of your march, and I am with much respect, soldiers, your friend and fellow servant. P. St. George Cook, Lieutenant Colonel, 2nd Dragoons, commanding. The address was received in silence. Several journal accounts note the moment, and the emotional register of those accounts is unusually subdued. Men processing something that required more space than the occasion allowed. A career Army officer had called their march the equal of any in history. A man who had arrived at Council Bluffs skeptical of everything about them, their discipline, their divided loyalties, their religious practices, their physical condition, had spent 12 months watching them and had arrived at a judgment that was, by any standard, extraordinary. They had earned it by walking into a desert and coming out the other side with their integrity intact. The return journey to Salt Lake Valley began almost immediately for most of the men. The route back was not the route they had come. Most groups took routes over the Sierra Nevada, crossing the mountain range in late summer before the passes closed. Jefferson Hunt, who had commanded Company A and was the most experienced trailman in the battalion, organized and led one of the major return parties. His route-finding skills, acquired on the march, made him the natural leader. His group crossed the Sierra in late summer 1847 and reached Salt Lake Valley in good time. Other groups arrived over a period of weeks and months, filtering into the growing city between September and November of 1847. 6 months after the battalion was mustered out, veterans who had stayed behind to work for John Sutter were standing nearby when James Marshall found gold at his mill. The California Gold Rush was beginning. Some battalion members stayed in California and joined the rush. Most did not. They had families waiting. They had a community to build. They had made a promise, implicit in the act of volunteering, that they would return. The majority went home. What they found when they got there was a community that had been building without them for a year and a half, and had built something real. Brigham Young had arrived in Salt Lake Valley with the advance company on July 24th, 1847, while the battalion was still in San Diego. He had looked out over the valley floor and made his decision. This was the place. The city plan had been laid out with Young's characteristic systematic thoroughness: wide streets on a grid, city blocks of consistent size, lots allocated to families by a combination of community assignment and practical need. Temple Square had been designated. Fields were being plowed and planted. Irrigation canals were under construction. The veterans arrived to find a skeleton city that needed everything they had to offer. Their contributions to the early building of Salt Lake City are documented in family histories, community records, and the physical archaeology of the city's earliest structures. Men who had spent months learning to build and survive in desert conditions brought specific knowledge back to the valley. Several of the early irrigation engineering decisions in Salt Lake City can be traced in the historical record to practices that veterans had observed among the Pima along the Gila River, the water management techniques of an indigenous community that had mastered desert agriculture over centuries, absorbed by American soldiers passing through for a few weeks in January 1847, and applied to a different desert landscape 700 miles to the north. History's influences travel in directions that the participants rarely anticipate. The road the battalion had cut began attracting traffic almost as soon as the survey maps were published. In the spring of 1849, 100,000 people set out for California in the greatest voluntary mass migration the American continent had yet seen. A significant fraction of them, particularly those coming from Texas, the Gulf Coast states, Arkansas, and the Lower South, were better positioned geographically to take the southern route than the Central Oregon-California Trail, the route through Tucson, down the Gila River, across the Colorado at Yuma, and through the desert to San Diego or Los Angeles became one of the major arteries of the gold rush. Jefferson Hunt was there to guide them. Between 1848 and the mid-1850s, Hunt led multiple emigrant parties along the southern route. His intimate knowledge of the water sources, forage spots, and critical route-finding decisions made him one of the most sought-after trail guides in the Southwest. People who traveled with Jefferson, Hunt reached California. People who dismissed his advice about route alternatives sometimes did not. the Death Valley disaster of 1849, in which a group of gold rush emigrants rejected Hunt's guidance and attempted a shortcut through what became Death Valley, killed several members of the party before the survivors staggered out. The documented connection between the Mormon Battalion's march and Jefferson Hunt's later trail guiding career is a direct line from one history to another. The road the battalion cut was not an abstraction. It was a specific physical path through specific terrain, and the men who had walked it carried knowledge that was immediately and demonstrably useful to the tens of thousands who followed. The Gadsden Purchase of 1853 made the Southern Corridor American territory in formal law. James Gadsden negotiated the purchase of a strip of southern Arizona and New Mexico from Mexico for $10 million. American planners understood that the route through this territory was the most practical southern wagon road and railroad corridor to California, and controlling it was strategically essential. The Gadsden Purchase was, in significant part, a real estate transaction whose purpose was to secure the route the Mormon Battalion had proven viable. This is documented in the negotiation records and in the congressional debates over the purchase. Senator Jefferson Davis, then the Secretary of War, and one of the purchase's strongest advocates, explicitly cited the need for a southern transcontinental railroad route as a primary justification. The route he was describing was the route Cook had surveyed and the battalion had pioneered. The Butterfield Overland Mail, which began operation in September 1858 under federal contract, ran twice-weekly stage service between St. Louis and San Francisco along what the contract called the Oxbow Route, a path that dropped south to El Paso, cut west through Tucson, followed the Gila River to the Colorado crossing at Yuma, and then crossed the desert to Los Angeles and up the coast to San Francisco. The total distance was approximately 2,800 miles. The stages made the trip in approximately 25 days. The Butterfield route was the Mormon Battalion's route. Not metaphorically, not approximately, substantially the same road through substantially the same country, using substantially the same water sources that Cook's survey had identified and that the battalion members had, in some cases, dug with their own hands from dry desert ground. The Southern Pacific Railroad, which connected New Orleans to Los Angeles and then to San Francisco in the 1870s and 1880s, followed the same corridor. The engineering surveys that preceded railroad construction in the borderlands drew on the maps Cook's expedition had produced, refined and updated by subsequent surveys, but originating in the same foundational documentation. The railroad changed the geography of the American Southwest more permanently than anything before or since. It made cities where there had been small settlements and settlements where there had been nothing at all. The modern Interstate 8, running from San Diego east, through El Centro and Yuma, and into southern Arizona, where it connects to Interstate 10 near Tucson, follows in its broad alignment the route that Philip St. George Cook mapped, and 543 men walked in the winter of 1846 and 1847. These are not coincidences or approximations. They are documented connections between a specific historical act and its specific historical consequences, traceable through engineering records, government documents, and the physical geography of a road that has been continuously used and continuously improved for 175 years. The indigenous communities whose territory that road ran through experienced its consequences in ways that the celebratory narrative of the battalion's accomplishment tends not to address. The Pima and Maricopa peoples who had fed the battalion at the Gila River continued their farming through the 1850s and into the 1860s with considerable success. American travelers on the southern emigrant route consistently noted the Pima villages as one of the most reliable resupply points on the entire journey. Their fields produced surpluses that the gold rush migration depended on to the same degree the battalion had depended on them in 1847. The Pima were, for roughly 2 decades after the battalion's passage, active and reasonably prosperous participants in the commerce of the southern route. Then the upstream diversions began. American settlers moving into the upper Gila and Salt River valleys in the late 1860s and 1870s began constructing irrigation systems that drew water from the same rivers feeding the Pima's fields. The legal framework governing water rights in the American West was being established in this period, and it was being established in ways that consistently prioritized upstream American settlers over downstream indigenous rights. The Pima, who had no political representation and whose traditional water rights had no standing in American courts, could not prevent the diversions. By the 1880s, the Pima's agricultural system, the one that Spanish missionaries had marveled at in the 1690s, that Cook had documented in 1847, and that Gold Rush emigrants had depended on through the 1850s, had been effectively destroyed by upstream water theft. The same community that had produced agricultural surpluses large enough to supply passing armies was experiencing famine by the 1890s. Federal Indian Service reports from this period document the collapse in language that is simultaneously clinical and damning. The Apache communities whose territory the battalion had skirted, moving carefully close to the Mexican border and keeping a cautious distance from the Apacheria, faced a different and harsher confrontation with American expansion. The Apache Wars, which dominated the American Southwest from the early 1850s through Geronimo's final surrender in 1886, were driven in significant part by the increasing American presence along the southern corridor that the Mormon Battalion's march had helped open. The military infrastructure that conducted those wars was positioned along the same corridor. The forts, Fort Buchanan, Fort Bowie, Fort Apache, Fort Grant, were placed where they were partly because the road network made them logistically supportable. This is the history that sits in the shadow of the battalion's achievement. The men who marched were not individually responsible for these consequences. Cook's official documentation makes clear that the battalion's behavior toward indigenous communities was more respectful than was standard for the era. Standage's journals document genuine curiosity about and admiration for the Pima, the Quechan, and others the column encountered. The men were, by the standards of their time and by any reasonable comparative measure, decent. But decent men, serving the apparatus of expansion, open roads, and roads are not neutral. They bring people, and people bring pressure. And pressure in the American West in the 19th century meant dispossession. The mechanics of this process are not mysterious. They operated everywhere the frontier went, and the Southern Corridor was no exception. Acknowledging this does not diminish the Mormon Battalion's accomplishment. It situates that accomplishment honestly in the context of what it actually meant and what it actually produced. The march was extraordinary. The road was real. The consequences were complex, and some of them were terrible, and all of them are part of the same story. The men themselves, in their later lives, remembered the march primarily as a story of faith and survival. Henry Standage returned to Utah and established himself as a farmer and community leader in Provo. His journal, maintained carefully throughout the march, was preserved by his family and eventually deposited at Brigham Young University, where it remains one of the primary sources for the battalion's history. He was interviewed late in his life by a church historian and described the march with the same quiet precision that characterized his journal, noting the distances and the hardships, the water sources and the dead mules, the campfire songs, and the small mercies of a warm day after a cold night. He was asked in that interview what he would tell a young man considering a similar undertaking. He thought about the question for what the interviewer described as a long moment. Then he said, "Tell him it is farther than he thinks and harder than he imagines, and worth doing." William Hyde, who had kept the journal that most explicitly wrestled with the contradiction of serving a flag that had failed his community, returned to Utah and eventually settled in St. George in the southwestern corner of the territory. His later writings suggest a man who had processed the march's ironies and arrived at something like peace with them. Not a peace that erased the contradictions, but one that held them without being destroyed by them. He served in local church leadership for decades and died in 1874. Jefferson Hunt, who had commanded Company A and proven himself the most capable trailman in the battalion, became one of the most consequential figures in early California history, though he is rarely remembered as such. He was one of the first members of the California legislature, serving in the inaugural session of 1849 and 1850. He continued guiding emigrant parties through the 1850s. He eventually returned to Utah and died in 1879, having outlived most of his contemporaries from the march. Melissa Burton Correa, who had refused to be sent to Pueblo and completed the entire march as one of the battalion's official laundresses, returned to Utah with her husband, William, and raised a large family in Provo. She was interviewed late in her life by a church historian seeking first-hand accounts of the march, and her description of the desert crossing is one of the most vivid that survives. She described the heat in terms that even the male journalists had not quite captured. The way it pressed down from above and rose from below, from the rocks and the sand, as if the desert itself was pushing back against the column's passage. She was also asked what moment she remembered most clearly. She described a day somewhere in the middle of the Sonoran Desert when the water was running low and the mules were struggling and the men around her were moving in the automatic, forward-tilted way of extreme exhaustion, not thinking, just walking. She said she realized, watching them, that they were not going to stop. Whatever happened next, they were not going to stop. That was the moment she knew they would make it. The monument in Salt Lake City that bears Phillip Street, George Cook's farewell address, was dedicated on July 16, 1927, exactly 80 years after the men were mustered out of service. The monument stands at the intersection of Main Street and South Temple, in the center of the city the veterans had helped build. The dedication ceremony drew thousands of people, including descendants of the original soldiers who had traveled from across the West to be present. The inscription on the monument includes Cook's words verbatim. Below them, carved into granite, are the names of every man who completed the march, 543 names. Each of them belongs to a man who, in the summer of 1846, made a choice that cost him something real and irretrievable. He left his family in the middle of a desperate journey. He marched into a desert for a government that had failed him. He did it for $8 a month, for his community's survival, and because the faith he had committed his life to told him the sacrifice was necessary. Looking at those names now, carved into stone in a city that exists in part because they walked, it is possible to trace a thread of consequence that runs from the summer of 1846 to the present moment. The road they cut is still being driven. The wells they dug fed travelers for a generation. The survey they enabled shaped the political and physical geography of the American Southwest in ways that are still visible in the interstate highway system, in the railroad corridors, in the location of cities that grew up along the routes they proved passable. Whether the sacrifice was worth it depends on what you think worth means. The community survived. The road was built. The Latter-day Saints established themselves in the Great Basin and were never again subjected to the organized violence that had destroyed their homes in Missouri and Illinois. The political calculation Brigham Young made, that service would purchase a measure of security, proved partially correct. The military payroll helped fund the migration. The road shaped the Southwest. The march became a foundational story of endurance that the community has carried for 175 years. What was lost is harder to measure, but no less real. The families who wintered alone on the Iowa prairie, the marriages strained by the separation, the children who grew up without their fathers for a year at a critical time, the men who died on the march, relatively few, given what the desert might have demanded, but real individuals with names and children and futures that ended in the sand. The indigenous communities whose lives were transformed in the years and decades after the battalion passed by the road and the traffic and the expanding American presence that followed. History rarely deals in clean victories. The Mormon Battalion's story is not a clean victory. It is a story of extraordinary human effort in service of goals that were simultaneously admirable and complicated. A community fighting for its survival with tools that contributed to someone else's dispossession. That complexity is not a reason to diminish what the men accomplished. It is a reason to tell the story accurately. The deep wells they dug in the desert, Cook mentioned them specifically in his farewell address, noting that future travelers would enjoy them, are the most literal image of the march's legacy. Physical objects made with human hands in country that tried to refuse them, dug for travelers who would never know the names of the men who dug them. Left in the sand as evidence that 500 men walked this way in the winter of 1846 and did not stop. They marched half naked and half fed through a wilderness, Cook wrote. They worked their way over mountains that seemed to bar all passage. They dug wells in deserts where no living creature found water. And then they went home. That is the Mormon Battalion's story. Not the mythology of it, not the triumphant march of faithful soldiers to a providential destiny, but the documented truth of it. Men who had every reason to be bitter, marching through conditions designed to produce brutality, who came out the other side with their integrity intact, who left no harm behind them, who built a road that is still being driven today. History may be searched in vain for an equal march of infantry. He was right. If this story moved you, leave a like so others can find it. Thank you for spending time with Western Pioneer Archives.